lesson, we're diving into some of the juiciest bits of criminal law: theft, robbery, and burglary. These all come from the Theft Act 1968, and yes, they all involve stealing, but each has its own twist. Consider the big picture. How do these offences connect? Okay, so let's start with theft. Well, theft is stealing. It means taking something that isn't yours. Then we've got robbery, which is stealing as well, but using or threatening force. And finally, we have burglary, which is going where you're not allowed as a trespasser to steal, hurt, or cause damage. So if you think of theft maybe as the base, then robbery is theft plus force. And then finally, we've got burglary, which is sneaking in, trespassing, plus some bad intentions. Let's take a closer look at theft. So this is Section 1 of the Theft Act. The official definition: a person is guilty of theft if he dishonestly appropriates property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. And this gives us 5 essential ingredients. 1, appropriation. 2, property. 3, belonging to another. And 4, dishonesty. And 5, intention to permanently deprive. We'll take a closer look at each one now, in turn. Let's start with appropriation. Now, this means taking over any right of the owner. That could be using, selling, or even destroying their stuff. The owner says yes to you, you can have it. Well, actually, that could still be counted as theft if it's dishonest. There was the case of R versus Gomez, in which the defendant tricked the manager into taking a stolen cheque. So even though the manager agreed, it was still theft, wasn't it? Because the defendant was being dishonest. Basically, if you get permission through dishonesty, it still counts as stealing. Another case is the R versus Hinks case. This showed that even accepting a gift can be theft if it's dishonest. Basically, in this case, Hinks befriended a vulnerable man and convinced him to give her money and a TV, saying they were gifts. Even though he gave them to her willingly, the court said that if you take something dishonestly, even if it's a gift, it can still count as theft. Another example would be borrowing a friend's phone and selling it. I mean, that's appropriation. It's actually also theft. Moving on to property. Section 4. So property, what does that mean? Well, almost anything really. Money, items, land, even a bank balance. But actually, interestingly, not wild flowers, if picked for fun, or information. There was the case of Oxford versus Moss from 1979, in which a student took exam questions, but that wasn't considered theft. I mean, information isn't considered property. The third aspect of theft is belonging to another, Section 5. So if something is in someone else's possession, control, or they have a right to it, well, it belongs to them, even if you own it. So taking it without permission can be theft. For example, grabbing your own car from the garage without asking could still be stealing, which is what occurred in the R versus Turner number 2 case, where the defendant stole, inverted commas, his own car from a garage that had it in for repairs, because the garage had possession of it. So then it counted as theft. The next aspect of theft is dishonesty. It's kind of the thinking part, the mens rea. This is tricky because there's no exact definition in the law, but the courts use something called the Ivy test from Ivy versus Genting Casinos. So first of all, the court asks, what did the defendant actually know or believe about the situation? For example, did they think they had permission? Or did they know they were taking something they shouldn't? Next, the court considers, would ordinary decent people, basically other members of the public or members of the public, think what the defendant did was dishonest? It doesn't matter what the defendant personally thought was right or wrong. It's what society thinks. And this differs from the old test, which was called the Gosh test. So previously, courts also asked whether the defendant themselves realised their actions were dishonest. But now with the Ivy test, that doesn't really matter. It's only about whether society would see that behaviour is dishonest. And that's regardless of the defendant's own views. And this means that the law focuses on society's standards of honesty, not the defendant's personal beliefs. In terms of evaluation, well, that definitely makes things simpler, doesn't it? But it might be less fair to sort of strange or unusual people who have different ideas about what is moral or right or wrong. Let's move on to intention to permanently deprive. Now, this means treating the property as your own and ignoring the owner's rights. A really good example would be, borrowing a friend's laptop and then deciding to sell it without asking them. What you're doing there really is treating that laptop as if it's your own, and you're disregarding your friend's rights as the owner. A couple of cases that are interesting to look at are versus Velumil. So in this case, the defendant took some cash from his workplace and he intended to pay it back later. However, he planned to repay the same amount, but not return the exact notes that he'd taken and coins. So the court decided that that was then theft because the law requires returning the actual property you were taken and not the value of that property. So even though he was going to pay back the same amount of money, it's not the exact same notes and coins that he took originally, so that counts as theft. Another court case is R versus Lloyd, and this shows that borrowing can be theft if you ruin the value. For example, copying a film and returning it. Lloyd, in this case, had borrowed some film reels, copied the movies, and then gave the reels back. And even though he returned them, the court said, well, that was theft because the value was basically taken. He'd gotten what he wanted from them. Quick summary for you then. Theft equals appropriation plus property plus belonging to another plus dishonesty plus intention to permanently deprive. You can use this little memory trick here, a pretty big dog inside, in order to remember that. Moving on now to robbery, theft, which is Section 8 of the Theft Act 1968. So the definition is threat versus force or threat used right before or during the stealing. So basically, robbery is theft with violence. The elements of a robbery are thus. So to start with, it's got to have all the same elements as theft. So you've got to have your A, P, B, D, I, which we've just looked at. It's also got to have force or threat, as we've said, even just a little bit. So for example, R versus Dawson and James, even a small push during a wallet snatch is enough. R versus Clouden, tugging a handbag, well, that equals force. We must also consider timing. So the force must happen immediately before or during the theft. In the case here of R versus Hale, two people stole a jewellery box and tied up the victim before leaving. The court said the theft was still happening when they used force, so it counted as robbery and not just theft. And the final element is on any person. Now, the force used can be on anyone, not just the property owner. Here are some robbery examples. If the defendant quietly takes a wallet, well, that's theft. But if the defendant shoves and grabs the wallet, well, then that's robbery. Let's consider some points of evaluation. Just a small push? Well, some people say that makes the law a little bit too harsh. And secondly, sometimes there seems to be a bit of a blurred line between theft and robbery. Tiny actions can mean a much bigger sentence. Let's look now at burglary, which is Section 9 of the Theft Act. Burglary comes, if you like, in two flavours, depending on when the intent to steal or cause harm happens. First of all, Section 9(1)(a), intent before entry. So, the defendant enters a building or part of it as a trespasser, and they intend to steal, cause GBH or damage. For example, a defendant breaks in planning to steal, and even if they don't manage to do that, even if nothing is taken, that is still burglary. Secondly, we have Section 9(1)(b), and this is the act after entry. So the defendant enters as a trespasser and then actually steals, tries to steal, or inflicts GBH. So, for example, a defendant enters a shop legally, but then goes into a staff-only area and steals. Well, that would be act after entry. Here's a little table to show you the key elements. So we've got entry, must be effective, even partial entry counts, putting a hand through a window, for example. Then you've got building or part, well, that's houses, shops, offices, even inhabited vehicles, like, what do you call them, mobile homes and so on. Then you've got trespasser, that means no permission or goes further than allowed. Let's just consider dwellings versus other buildings quickly too. So let's explore how burglary is treated differently based on the type of building. So when we refer to a dwelling, we basically mean a place where people live, like a house or an apartment. And burglary in a dwelling carries harsher sentences because, after all, it's considered more personal and far more invasive. The law tries to protect people's sense of security in their own homes. But there are some complexities, so take the definition of trespasser. That's not always clear, is it? Suppose someone is invited into a house, but then enters a room where they aren't allowed. Does that make them a trespasser? It depends on what they were permitted to do, and the law can be fuzzy here. This focus on dwellings makes social sense, but can result in uneven sentencing, especially in edge cases where the rules aren't obvious. Here's some quick revision for you just to finish off then. So theft is dishonesty. Dishonestly appropriates property belonging to another with intent to permanently deprive. And you've got 5 elements there as the key points, and you've also got some key cases to refer to. Next, we've got robbery, which is all the elements of theft, but also the use or threat of force immediately before or during theft. And even small force counts in this regard. And finally, we have burglary. So enters as a trespasser to steal or do damage, or GBH, or actually does it. And trespasser here is our key concept. So before we go, I'll just leave you with a quick joke. Why did the burglar take a shower before breaking in? Because he wanted to make a clean getaway. And all that scurrying and click-clacking you can hear is my little dog walking around on the ground. Apologies for that.